Hello again, everyone who is joining us today. Thank you for joining this event, Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage in Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. This event is brought to you by the Clean Energy Ministerial's Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage Initiative. If we go to the next slide, I would just like to say my name is Isabel McCann. I am the technical coordinator for the event today. I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And I am just going to walk through a couple housekeeping items here. So this event is being recorded. It will be shared with attendees in the coming days. Everyone is automatically automatically muted upon joining the webinar. But if you would like to, we definitely want everyone to ask questions. We want this to be very interactive. There are two features in Zoom that you can use to interact. The Q&A function. So it is specifically labeled Q&A in your Zoom toolbar. That is where we would like for all of you to ask all of your questions throughout the event. We will have some time for Q&A towards the end after the presentations have concluded. So please drop any questions you have in there. If you would like to introduce yourself, if you have any thoughts or comments, please use the chat feature to add those thoughts and comments. And if you have any technical issues, you can use the chat feature to message me directly. Like I said, my name is Isabel McCann. You can just find me in the chat dropdown and let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, you can also go to support.zoom.us. It's probably going to have any of the answers to any of the questions that I would answer for you anyways. And then there is an audio settings. So again, feel free to take a look at your Zoom toolbar if you're having any troubles hearing or seeing us. And I'm sure that there will be a solution for you there in the toolbar or in the FAQ. So with that, that's all from me. I'm going to hand it over to Juho Lipponen, and he will take it from here.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and thanks to NREL for hosting us today for this webinar. So hi everybody, my name is Juho Lipponen. I'm coordinator of the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, and thank you so much for your attendance and for your time today. I'll give you a very brief introduction to the SEM and the SEM CCUS initiative. This won't take long, but for those of who don't know us, it's perhaps good to know who is hosting you today. So the Clean Energy Ministerial itself is a global process to accelerate clean energy. It's got 30 member countries, East and West, North and South. And 90% of the global clean energy investment is done within the SEM countries. But also the SEM countries are responsible for 3/4 of the CO2 emissions. So this is a very relevant global partnership. Now, under the ministerial wider framework, there are a number of work streams that cover a wide spectrum of clean energy issues, and one of them is CCUS, Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage. We're in existence since 2018. We have 14 countries as our members. You see the flags on the left side. And I think the only thing to say here is that this is a very, I would say it's a critical mass of carbon capture countries active today. But our door is open to all new countries that get more and more interested in CCUS in the future to come and join us and to come and learn. And you will notice that the 3 countries who we present today are not, at least not yet, SEM CCUS members, but hopefully they will be soon. We may come back to that later. And finally, the way our initiative works, we work with industry, trying to accelerate project deployment. That's a very important part of our work with different partnerships ranging from oil and gas to cement, steel, and so forth. We also work with the finance sector, providing a platform to discuss CCUS as an investment opportunity with a range of different types of banks. And importantly, we are a platform to share best practice We do that amongst our members in monthly sessions where we compare our different CCUS policy approaches, and also towards the wider public, as we are doing right now today with this particular webinar. If you want to learn more about us, we will have our email address and contact details at the end of the slide deck, and you will be able to contact us. With that, that's the introduction, and I will hand it over to Henriette to lead us through today's panel. Over to you, Henriette.
Thank you very much, Juho. My name is Henriette Nesheim. I work in the Norwegian Ministry for Petroleum and Energy, and Norway is one of the 4 co-leads of this CCUS initiative. Warm welcome to all of you and to this CCUS webinar with a special focus on the recent developments in Denmark, Sweden and Finland and what they do on CCUS. And as you may know, the Nordic region has a high level of trust and collaboration on many aspects of the economy and society. For instance, we have a joint power market for a long time, even before the EU market. And since 2018, there has been a Nordic group of CCUS, which emerged under the umbrella of the Nordic Council of Ministers. So this group met last week in Reykjavik. And as most of you know, Norway has a long history of storing CO2 and have done so for almost 30 years and have in 2 commercial projects in operation. And the CCUS initiative is very glad to bring you today's webinar, which is dedicated on the new kids on the block, which is in the Nordic region. So while Denmark, Sweden and Finland are not members of the CCUS yet, we are very curious to hear and happy to present developments from these interesting non-members. So Denmark's recent developments are starting to be very well known, and it's great that also Sweden and Finland are getting more and more active in the area of CCUS. So the objective of today's program is to give you an idea of the recent development in these countries, and also to discuss what have led to their current approaches and how the Nordic region can accelerate together. So we are very happy to have 3 expert speakers with us today. First, Jasmin Sharzad, Special Advisor at the Danish Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities. We have Svante Söderholm, Senior Advisor at Swedish Energy Agency. And Juho Korteniemi, that some of you SEM members know from he's also the SEM representative from Finland. He's a chief specialist in the Finnish Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment. So thank you very much for joining us. And I think I will just pass the floor to Jasmin for the first insights into Denmark.
Thank you very much, Henriette. I think that that was the perfect introduction, the new kid on the block, because that's basically also how we see ourselves. To those of you who don't know me, my name is Jasmin. I'm a special advisor with the Ministry of Climate, Energy and Utilities here in Denmark. I work in what we call our CCS team and have done so basically for 2 years now since the office started, but have been with the ministry for 4 or 5 years now. If we change the slide, I will start by introducing what has happened politically in Denmark, and then go a bit further into sort of the implementation details. So basically what happened back in 2020 with the CCS agenda is that a broad majority of political parties in the Danish parliament agreed that now CCS should be used as a climate tool. And that was quite novel at the time, and it was quite an important decision. And with that decision followed a funding scheme as well, and sort of an emphasis on how CCS should be used, emphasizing that this does not mean less ambitions on the climate agenda, and that we should sort of use it in the hard to abate sectors. So since 2020, we have been working on developing a Danish CCS strategy. We finalized that in 2021, 2022. So basically, I have pointed out some of the main points on this slide. The decision was made to make import and export of CO2 legal. Funds were allocated to our geological institution to investigate sort of potential storage sites. And also sort of this emphasis on, while doing all of this work, we should have dialogue with municipalities, regions, and citizens, but also, of course, the industry, and a CCUS, a stakeholder forum, was established. Lastly, sort of the major important decision from the strategy is that Denmark should be a European hub for CCS. And this should be rolled out on market terms in the long run. I'll get a little bit back to that and what this means, being a European hub for CCS. Then last year, so the final major decision was on the state co-ownership of storage permits, which is set at 20% for offshore licenses. Then there was also a decision to start looking into an onshore pilot project at Stenlille. So this is basically what has happened in the last 2 years. If you go to the next slide, then it's fine to have sort of a political framework and have some major political decisions. But since then, we have been working quite hard to implement it. And that has also both entailed legislation, there were some laws that needed to be changed, but then also starting to roll out sort of our funding schemes, engaging with international actors. And just to pinpoint some of the highlights on this, I can say that on the implementation side, the first pilot project permit was given for exploration and storage of CO2 in the North Sea. This was a demonstration project. And then also 3 full-scale exploration permits were given in the beginning of February of this year. It's for the Bifrost and Greensand projects. On the funding scheme side, we have received 2 bids in the first round of our funding scheme from the companies Ørsted and Visberegning, that's sort of combined heat and power plants. And also our geological institution has started their seismic data gathering campaigns all around the country. And the Danish Energy Agency have started their environmental impact assessment. So a lot of stuff going on in different authorities in Denmark. On the sort of international side, we have concluded an MOU with the Netherlands and Belgium on sort of general CCS cooperation. As of last week, we have actually also concluded a JDI with Germany. So that was also quite big for us. And finally, Denmark and Belgium were the 2 first countries to sort of enable the cross-border transportation of CO2 when the purpose is storage under the seabed. A lot of stuff going on. If I just sort of summarize some of the numbers that you can maybe take away from this also, is that with all the different funding schemes that we have set aside, around 5 billion euros have been allocated to get this value chain up and running. And we sort of expect that it will result in reductions and removals of 3.2 million tons of CO2 annually from 2030. If we continue to the next slide, this is, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but you will get the slides afterwards. But here you can sort of see, okay, what major political agreements were concluded, what legislation, and what has happened on sort of the implementation next side. If we continue. Oh, that was a little bit too fast. Sometimes we're asked, so all this, these subsidy schemes, how should we understand it? So we have sort of made this table. So it's important to say that we have three sort of different approaches, and the money that has been allocated with different purposes. So basically, the CCUS fund and the GSR funds, the purpose of those is to get the value chain up and running, whereas the next fund is to sort of achieve negative emissions. And you can probably also guess when you look at the budget that those reductions, they're sort of cheaper. Actually, I forgot to include the expected reductions. I can do that before sending out slides. But that's basically the takeaway from here. You can also see that some of them have a longer contract period. They start a little bit differently, and the support period is also a little bit differently, but those are technicalities. If we continue. So just to also give you an idea what is happening nationally and how does it play out with the things we're planning on an international scale. So the potential for capture of CO2 from Danish emitters is around 5.4 to 10.8 million tons of CO2 in 2040. And the major emitters are waste incineration and sort of industry, combined heat and power plants. But we also have quite a significant potential from the biogas plants. And most of these entities are located in the major cities in Denmark. So the capital, Copenhagen, being one of them, Aalborg being another big one up in the north of Jutland. So why do I sort of emphasize that? Because, well, if you look at the numbers, I will go a little bit into storage capacity as well. You see that the potential is not that huge in Denmark when you compare to other countries. So obviously, this is also why there's a political mandate to sort of make this an international endeavor. And if we go to the next slide. Yes. You get sort of an overview of where our potential storage sites are located. And just to say briefly, our Geological Institute has evaluated that there's probably around 12 to 22 billion tons CO2 storage opportunity in sort of all of Denmark. And I just told you what our capture potential is. So if you do the math, it's quite simple. It makes sense to start importing the CO2 if we want to get up in scale. So the names you see here on the map, sort of the different colors, they are the sites where our geological institution and the Danish Energy Agency right now are conducting seismic data gathering and also the environmental impact assessment. So this is sort of where we estimate that there can be potential. And as you can also see, some of the sites are onshore, others are what we call nearshore. Don't ask me the definition. It's basically, can you see it? And then we also have some offshore potential far out in the left corner of the North Sea. If we continue, okay, maybe if you go back, I can actually bring a point before this slide, because if you look, if it's possible to go back, yes. I just want to briefly touch upon sort of the onshore perspective, because it's very important to say, given the political mandates that I told you about earlier, we have also done quite extensive work in terms of talking to municipalities, The authorities have been out speaking with citizens. They've had citizen meetings where the neighbors and sort of other interested parties could show up. There's also been quite some media interest in what is happening onshore. And I mentioned this to say that this is sort of an extensive process. It's not just something that you do from one day to the other. There's been quite a lot of preparatory work behind this. Yes, now you can continue to the next slide. So this slide basically shows you, and it's important to say, this shows you all the projects that are interested in CO2, in doing CO2 storage in Denmark, that we have the knowledge of. There might be some other projects that we don't know about. But the two first ones here, Greensand and Bifrost, that are offshore, they are the ones who have received exploration permits. All of these projects in combination expect to have a storage capacity of up to 52 million tons CO2 in 2030. Oh, it says 30 to 32. That is, of course, a mistake. It should have been 2032. And if we sort of continue to the next slide, I just want to sort of briefly sum up. So now I have told you about the political framework, where are we on implementation, the different funding schemes, and the potential storage sites that we're looking into. If we sort of just touch upon the next steps enabling CCS in Denmark, what we're looking into is sort of the future tenders and subsidy schemes. So the future rounds. Now we have some learning points. What are we going to do in the future? We still have some tasks in terms of the legal framework for transporting CO2. There's also some decisions in terms of state participation in future storage licensing rounds. And then this clear regulatory framework for CCS on our waste incineration and combined heat and power plants, which we also need to solve. And then, of course, the last 3 points relates to sort of enabling this international market. So the cross-border infrastructure, bilateral arrangements or agreements on transportation of CO2, but also making sure to support the development of international and EU regulation on CCS. That was it from me. I have heard that there will be a questioning round later. So I think now I will hand over to Svante from Sweden.
Thank you, Jasmin. My name is Svante Söderholm, and I'm working at the Swedish Energy Agency at the Center for Carbon Capture and Storage. So many thanks to the organizer for giving me the opportunity to say a few words why Sweden sees CCS as an important tool to reach climate goals and what we do in the field. Next slide, please. The basis for CCS in Sweden is found in the Swedish climate policy framework. In June 2017, Sweden's parliament, Riksdag, decided to introduce a climate policy framework with a climate act. And it's important to remember that the framework aims to create order and stability in climate policy, and it will provide business and society with long-term conditions to implement the transition needed to address the challenge of climate change. And the framework contains, among many things, climate goals. And what is important when it comes to climate goals today is that the goals are that Sweden should have net zero emission of greenhouse gases by 2045, and thereafter negative emissions. And this means that we are working with a reduction of 85% compared to 1990. So we need some offset, that is, we say, supplementary measures to counterbalance the remaining emissions of what is expected to be 10 to 11 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents 2045, when we have reached net zero, and thereafter we should have negative emissions. Next slide. So if I continue with the policy measures, another important thing when it comes to CCS activities in Sweden is a program called Industrial Leap. In the end of 2017, the government launched a long-term program to accelerate and support the transition of the industry. And of course, that means risk sharing, and it's called the Industrial Leap. And very briefly, it focused on carbon intensive industries such as cement, iron and steel, chemical industry, and refineries. And this is hard to abate industries and industries in which the emission of carbon dioxide is inherent in the production process. This means that carbon capture and storage is the only feasible way to decrease these emissions. And to give you some idea about the figures we are talking about, Sweden has emissions of around 50 million tons per year, and 1/3 of these comes from the industry, and 2/3 of them come from these carbon intensive industries. And the next step in the Industrial Leap was taken 2019, when bio-CCS was included in the program. And the basic idea behind the program is that it shall support huge and complex technology leaps to significantly reduce the process-related emissions in Sweden's industry. And it can support research, feasibility studies, research and development, and also to some extent investments. And these slides summarize the program in figures. It's a large program that will run for many years, 22 years to be more precise, and the budget this year is 130 million euro. Next slide, please. So when I've said a little about those two pillars and that there is a need for CCS to decrease the emissions from the Swedish industry, I will now turn to another policy measures. And as I said, the Swedish climate goals makes it necessary to create negative emissions that can offset the remaining emissions in 2045, and that was around 10 to 11 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And this was the reason behind a public inquiry on supplementary measurements that was carried out a couple of years ago. But in this public inquiry, there was the main part was on bio-CCS. Even if there was a lot of discussions also about the implementation of CCS in Sweden, independent of it was fossil emissions or biogenic emissions. And the inquiry treated mainly three supplementary measurements: increased carbon sink in forest and land, verified emissions in other countries, and of course, as I said, bio-CCS, which was the main part. And the report shows clearly that bio-CCS is an important tool to reach climate goals, and that the development of bio-CCS and CCS on fossil emissions are connected. I mean, if we build up some kind of infrastructure or harbor or something, both kinds of emissions will. And this inquiry also showed that there's a huge potential in Sweden for negative emissions through bio-CCS. The potential biogenic carbon dioxide that could be captured and stored is around 20 to 30 million tons each year. And without any trouble, you should be able to do bio-CCS on those 10, 11 million tons that is needed to meet the Swedish climate goals. And the main points in the report from the inquiry has so far resulted in several government assignments to the Swedish Energy Agency. And those that I will talk about now, they were finalized in 2021. First of all, the inquiry said that a support system is needed since there's no business case today for negative emission, and a support scheme in the form of reverse auction was proposed. A bilateral treaty with, in the first place, Norway, is needed to allow export of Swedish carbon dioxide for permanent storage in another country, in this case Norway. and a proposal for a treaty with Norway was produced. And of course, other means of support than financial is also needed to roll out CCS in Sweden. And a national center for carbon capture and storage was started as a part of the Swedish Energy Agency. And it's worth to note that although Sweden has realized that carbon capture and storage will be an important tool to reach climate goals, Sweden has no formal carbon capture and storage strategy. And that means that there is no strategy adopted by the parliament or one put forward by the government. And the inquiry in also pointed out the need for research and development and support investment. And the instrument for this was already in place. It was the industrial leap that I mentioned a few slides ago. Next slide, please. So what is happening today? When it comes to what we are working with today, or what we have recently finished, there are two important issues that are connected. One is reporting and accounting of negative emissions. There were several governmental assignments on reporting and accounting that were connected and partly overlapping. The responsible authorities, Swedish Energy Agency and the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, will lump these assignments together and have delivered reports to the government on the reporting and accounting of negative emissions. And in brief, we found that there is a lack of guidelines for reporting and accounting, especially on the European level. So today, Sweden has no guidelines for how we should report the negative emissions to the European Union. And this is a problem, since the first carbon dioxide is expected to be stored 2026, 2027, and that is in the near future. And the other is that utilities and industries would like to have two revenue streams in the case of bio-CCS. Besides the support from state, they would like to have a stream from selling negative emissions on the voluntary market for negative emissions. And the Swedish Energy Agency has proposed that enterprises that create negative emissions with the aid of the support scheme can sell them on a voluntary market. But in order to avoid double claiming, these negative emissions cannot be used for offset. And since they will already be used for offset for Swedish national climate goals. And the buyer can make contribution claims, which means that they state that they have contributed to Sweden's national goals and to the European Union's commitment to the Paris Agreement. And of course, we are working hard to launch the first auction, hopefully in the end of this year or beginning of next year. And right now we are working hard with the state aid approval from the European Union Commission. And so as some of you also know, that the development in Sweden, as in other countries, depends on what is happening on a European level. Last year, the Commission has published a framework for a regulation about the certification of carbon dioxide removals. And the proposed regulation is now treated by the member states and the parliament in the European Parliament. And at the agency, we're supporting our governmental office with this work on this regulation for certification of carbon dioxide removals. It's important that it works out, that all pieces will be correct, so we could use the potential and get the credit for the bio-CCS that we're able to do. And what is also on our way is to finalize the treaty with Norway. And after that, we will start to have negotiations with another countries, since we would like to be able to store, and of course the Swedish enterprises would like to be able to store their carbon dioxide at several storage sites, not to be just forced to use one country and one or two operators. And what is also very interesting is that the Swedish Energy Agency has recently got a governmental assignments on policy measures for CCS on fossil emissions. And it's also, to some extent, we should treat what policy measures are needed to implement carbon capture and utilization on a broad scale in Sweden. Thus, it's clear that the government sees carbon capture, utilization and storage as an important and necessary tool to reach national climate goals and to fulfill Sweden's part of the European Union's commitment towards the Paris Agreement. So with that, I give the floor to my colleague from Finland, Juho Korteniemi, please.
Thank you, Svante. Now I'm happy to continue with the Finnish CCUS developments. So I actually have 3 slides. I will start with the developments, and then I will go with the strategy and the let's say one kind of a recommendation slide based on the research we commissioned just a while ago. We actually, just to give you some kind of a background, we actually had a parliamentary elections just 1 month ago, and the government negotiation process is still ongoing. We expect to have the coalition government, the new one, to maybe start in June at some point. And let's see what kind of political guidelines they give us on maybe on CCUS. Practically, what Svante also mentioned, the carbon removals topics and the aspects, they are also in the interest of many stakeholders, and let's see how the politicians see that. But that is something what we will learn in maybe in 1 month or 2 months time, how the new government will see the things. So that's why I also start my slide that we, in general, the key policy target, which also affects on the interest on the CCUS related matters, is of course the climate neutrality targets already by 2035. It's in the climate law. And now when we have these elections ongoing for the next government, they of course can let's say consider if they would change the law or no. Some rumors say that they will not change that law so that the target will remain. But of course, as a civil servant, I don't want to speculate anymore. So they will then, we will see the result when the government program is there out. But definitely, of course, many of the climate activities and clean energy related activities will continue. We also have a hydrogen strategy. It's actually in the form of a decision in principle, and it's based on the climate and energy strategy. It's kind of ambitious, even saying that maybe we could produce like 10% of hydrogen of what Europe needs by end of the decade. And why hydrogen is mentioned here is that in CCU, we often see solutions which are based on the other hand on manufacturing hydrogen, and on the other hand capturing carbon and then producing fuels or products of that of those kind of components. So some of the kind of developments. So financing has been one of the topics. We have had a specific kind of financing of 150 million for investments in which have a carbon capture and utilization aspects. In those, we have also had financing for hydrogen projects. And actually those also usually involve, after making hydrogen, there is, for example, methanization or some other process to complement the whole thing, as I explained. So we have had a kind of significant amount of financing, something like 300 million during the last couple of years for these kind of investments, which include more or less both, usually for fuels, for kind of electrofuels, as we call them, using carbon from waste to energy plants, and then also from cement plant in Lappeenranta, Vantaa and Tampere, these cities, for example, in the southern and eastern part of Finland. Of course, we have to finance those projects with public money. There is, of course, they have to close the whole financing package and then build the plant. So we will hopefully learn more of those projects later on, and maybe even those projects could be presented in this kind of platform, such as this one later on. And we have also included e-fuels in the transport fuel distribution obligation. And that is actually also kind of one of the ways to create market for this type of fuels. And of course, this is also something what the politicians can now, let's say, reconsider when they are making government program, how they see this. Then I have sometimes used the word that we are the country of radical CCU innovations, that we have companies. We have actually today there was a kind of a opening ceremony for a plant making proteins out of thin air, as they say, the company says. So meaning that the kind of capturing carbon can also be used for this kind of products, which maybe don't come into mind as the first option. We have also a company, for example, which is developing solutions to capture carbon from office air, so to say. So there are many things ongoing, many innovations also raising, and of course some of the innovation financing is directed to this. And we have in general, let's say, kind of a technology neutral policy making when it comes to innovation and investments of, for example, renewable energy. So yeah, actually more funding can be directed and has been directed through technology neutral programs. So you don't find the only truth by just exploring that what targeted programs Finland has. We have many more programs which can finance this type of solutions. So, and there is in general growing interest to carbon removals. This includes, of course, BECCS, which is kind of a CCS solution. Maybe just to say that in Finland, when and if our companies develop BECCS, they need partners abroad. Like Sweden, we don't have any geological sites to store CCS. Actually, according to the Finnish law, currently, it's even forbidden to store CO2 in Finland. So it's impossible. And then, of course, if that would be done, then the CO2 should be transported to a country where that opportunity is available to store CO2. That's just the reality. And also there are other options, of course, than CCS. So for example, biochar investments are interested in carbon removals thematics and can be related to that as well. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Then I just mentioned some points about the strategy. This was prepared by the present or the previous government. How do you see it in this situation? So this government strategy. So there are many lines saying that we should develop these solutions, and as part of kind of this strategy, we have financed those, including, for example, waste incineration-based CCU. And then these kind of transport fuel mandates, transport fuel kind of blending mandates, so that is also mentioned in the strategy. And then, of course, this legislation, like Svante also said, that there are some unclarities also in EU level, for example, that how these things will be accounted, for example, in emissions. So these kind of things should be clarified. This is practically the strategy. Be more clear and then develop things. That's what we have been doing as well as we can in this environment. Then the next slide. So we commissioned a report, as we have a kind of a government strategic research kind of tool, I would say maybe, inside the Finnish government. And then there is now a study commissioned, carbon dioxide use and removal prospects and policies, and that's in English. It will be released in Finnish only later than the English version. And I think if you are really interested in what happens in Finland, markets, technologies, policies, whatever, so you should really take a look on that report. So I have 3 slides, but there's something like 150 pages in that report. And then this paper is, I know that there are people who will be presenting maybe some of this kind of ideas to our politicians as well now when they are negotiating. So there are a few recommendations. This list is not like, it doesn't include all, but some kind of examples. So of course that we should have a strategy guidelines from the politicians for this carbon dioxide and removal thematics. And then we should probably have targets for negative emissions. Of course, there are other than industrial solutions, but either way, included in all, or then also separate for industrial removals. Then we have to update a few laws, like I think the previous presenters explained also, for example, regarding transportation. Then we, of course, have to sign agreements with other countries if we do PECs, for example, because we don't have that opportunity to store, as I explained. And then, of course, financial incentives are quite important for research and also for deploying this, as maybe at the moment the market doesn't provide enough income as such. Then also role of voluntary markets is very important, and then international cooperation. And in fact, there is also a list, if you read the report, about possible other types of policy measures which we could then study more when going forward. Even such a small thing that could, for example, public procurement somehow boost these solutions. But there are many others. I think take a look on that report, and then happy to discuss more. Now I would maybe hand over to the CCUS initiative colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Juho and Svante and Jasmin as well. Very interesting to hear the latest update from the other Nordic countries. I think that we just have currently seen that there is a kind of upswing in the interest in general in CCUS, and this has been like a kind of a roller coaster for some years. It's been very interesting for some years, and it's been a little bit low on the political agenda. But what would you see as the main drivers behind this newfound interest in CCUS? If I start with you, Juho, in Finland.
Yes, the other Juho, yes. Well, maybe two things. So the other one is that we still need to, of course, reduce emissions. So then we go to CCU, and then we see, for example, these electrofuels, that there are still some usage, end use, let's say, applications where fuels might be needed, for example, marine or air transport. And then, of course, very low carbon fuels would be kind of an interesting option. So for CCU, and also some of these more radical solutions, like producing proteins out of kind of carbon in the air. So that's the other one. Then the negative emissions is clearly the other one, that if we want to go climate neutral, we also need that negative kind of emissions. And then, of course, for example, BECS or DACs could offer that option. And then that is driving these discussions forward.
Thank you. And what do you think, Svante? Is that the main driver for Sweden's interest in CCUS?
I mean, the main driver for Sweden is very similar to what you said about Finland. First of all, we have our climate goals, and we will need negative emissions. And what I would think is more important to discuss in this context is how the public view CCS. I mean, for 10 years ago or something like that, it was seen as one way to extend the fossil era and continue to use fossil fuels and not to do any mitigations or abatement measures. And now it's quite clear from the reports from IPCC and the International Energy Agency that if the world is going to meet the Paris Agreement with 1.5 or 2 degrees, we need to do CCS and we need to do CCUS, both on fossil and biogenic emissions.
Thank you.
And that,
yeah.